Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's May 29th. It's time for another batch of Deep Space updates. And we go to China for our first launch of the last couple of weeks. On the 17th of May, there was a Long March 3B/E going to geostationary orbit, carrying a Beidou 3 navigation system. So, they've been launching these navigation satellites. They've already completed China's, navigation network. This is a spare satellite which is being launched. So yeah, there's actually some really cool stuff about this because some crazy person apparently got footage from 300 meters away or less, which is frankly crazy. But it's one of the better set of launch footage from a Chinese launch in a long time. On 19th of May, there was a Falcon 9 carrying Starlink Group 6-3. That, of course, is the V2 mini satellites, only 22 of those on the rocket, again, going to low Earth orbit and communications. 20th of May, there was another Falcon 9 Block 5 from Vandenberg this time. And this was a sort of strange rideshare mission carrying both Iridium and OneWeb satellites into, high inclination orbit. Also on board was a satellite called JOESat, which was an experiment that was a collaboration between OneWeb and the European Space Agency. It's basically a next generation communication satellite, and its main thing is that it's very good at hopping from one footprint to another in rapid succession to fill in holes in the network or to provide, change the load or capabilities on the network. So it's called JOESat because a joey is a young kangaroo, and this is able to hop all over the place. On the 21st of May, Long March 2C from Jihuan, carrying 3 satellites. It carried a pair of satellites for the Macau University of Science and Technology. These are apparently, according to one source, which has since had the post deleted, these are going to be investigating the magnetosphere in tandem. There's also another satellite called Luogia 2, and that's going to be doing, it's going to be imaging. So it has imaging capabilities which go down to half-meter resolution in spot format, and up to wide angle it can do 1 meter resolution. On the 21st of May, we had Axiom-2 launching a Dragon space capsule, Freedom, on top of a Falcon 9, of course. So this was a launch, of course, taking a crew of 4 to the International Space Station. Private astronauts. Some might say space tourists, but I think in this case it definitely leads towards more the private astronauts. There's basically Peggy Whitson is the commander. She is working for Axiom. There's the pilot, John Schaffner, who's a rich guy that's paying to fly. There are 2 astronauts from Saudi Arabia. There's Rihanna Barnawi and Ali Arkani. Now, they are on the space station right now. They're going to be returning in the next few days. There's been updates on their launch all the time, and I'm hoping that the Saudi TV station doesn't take down this video because they've apparently been hitting people with copyright claims, and I'm waiting for you. But this was also interesting because it's the first launch of a crewed Dragon where the booster was able to return back to the launch site for recovery. And that's a new technology that they've been able to demonstrate, by adjusting the launch trajectory and adjusting their fuel burn. 24th of May, there was a Soyuz carrying Progress MS-23. That's just a cargo ferry to the Russian side of the International Space Station. Not only is it carrying supplies for the station in terms of hardware, it also is carrying consumables for the astronauts or the cosmonauts and propellant for the space station. 25th of May, we had the 3rd launch of Korea's KSLV-2, also known as Nuri, and this carried the first actual operational payload of a number of different satellites. The primary satellite was NextSat-2, which was a 180 kilogram synthetic aperture radar satellite. There was another couple of small satellites called JLC-101, KSAT-3U, Loomer T1, and Snipe, which is actually 4 different CubeSats. So this was also interesting because it's actually lower mass than the previous mission. So the first Nuri mission had a dummy payload. It failed. The second one succeeded. It demonstrated launching 1,500 kilograms. Now this was an operational launch. It was only 240 kilograms, and that meant that it was able to actually get the hardware into sun-synchronous orbit, because from their launch site, they have to do a dogleg maneuver with a third stage to curve the trajectory around into the target, azimuth of 191 degrees. On the 26th of May, we had Electron from Rocket Lab launching the final pair of Tropic satellites in a mission called Coming to a Storm Near You. Yeah, that's great. We now have, 5 Tropic satellites in orbit. They will be doing their best to no doubt find hurricanes and do science on them. I'm glad that has gone. Also on the 26th of May, there was Soyuz 2.1A with a Fregat second stage, or third stage. This was launching from Vostochny into low Earth orbit, carrying a satellite called Condor FKA. And this is the third of the Condor satellites. So the first one was launched, I think, back in 2013. And there was a second one soon after that was launched for South Africa. Both of these satellites operated fairly well, but they had very short lives. And since then, they've been trying to fix up the satellite, come up with improvements to the design to improve its on-orbit robustness. And so this is the third launch. Of course, those previous launches happened before the whole annexing Crimea thing went on. So now Russia, the second one that was launched was for South Africa, and they had originally pitched this to be available for other countries. A lot of those countries are no longer interested in buying satellites from Russia. On the 27th of May, there was another Falcon 9 carrying Arabsat 7B, also known as Badr 8. This is a 4.5-ton satellite that goes to geostationary orbit. It's expected to have a lifetime of about 15 years. It's going to sit at 26 degrees east and service the Middle East. So yeah, it was built by satellite. It was basically a replacement for satellite that was already up there, which went out of business, went out of operation. It was going to be launched a few days before that, but they had a scrub, I believe, because of weather, and yeah, it went off successfully the second time. This satellite also includes an experimental photon, light-based downlink called Telio, space-to-ground optical communications capability that gigabit speed, so that will be great if they make it work. 29th of May, India launched a GSLV Mark II, not the Mark III, right? And the last time they tried to launch a Mark II was back in 2021, and that launch was a failure. They've obviously been doing some investigation to clear the vehicle for flight again. And yeah, this time it got to go. It's carrying a satellite for part of the IRNSS, India's regional navigational satellite system. So currently there are 7 of these satellites in geosynchronous orbit. When I say geosynchronous, these satellites are actually inclined slightly, so they librate above, and below the equator from the Earth's point, from the surface point of view. So this is like India's domestic geo positioning system. And this is NVS-1. This is the first satellite of the second generation of these navigational satellites. So yeah, it's also carrying an indigenously developed atomic clock, and it marks the return to flight of the Mark II GSLV. And finally, literally a few hours ago, we had Long March 2 FG for carrying Shenzhou 16, and that's carrying 3 Chinese astronauts to the Chinese space station. So we have the mission commander is Jing Haipeng, that is his 4th space flight. There's Zhu Yangzhu, the first space flight, and Gui Haiqiu, who is a professor at Beijing University rather than a member of the Chinese Armed Forces, and therefore the first Chinese civilian to fly on a Chinese spacecraft. So with this launch, it sets a new record for the number of people in orbit. So we have 11 on the International Space Station because we still have the Axiom-2 crew there. And we'll have 6 on China's space station, bringing it to a total of 17, which the previous record was 14 with Inspiration 4, Soyuz MS-18, Crew 2, and Shenzhou 12. But if you're talking about the number of people in space, That record was broken earlier this week. On the 25th of May, there were 20 people in space for a few minutes as Virgin Galactic made its return to flight. And of course, when we say space, this is above the 50-mile marker rather than the 100 kilometers, which many countries use. So Unity 25 went to 87.2 kilometers or 54.2 miles. This is the 5th space flight for Virgin Galactic's Unity spacecraft. So they carried 2 crew members, Mike Masukio and Frederick Sturko. But in the back, they had Beth Moses, Luke Mays, Jamila Gilbert, and Christopher Hui. So yeah, that was a record for the number of people simultaneously in space and a return to flight for Virgin Galactic, who hope to be actually carrying paying passengers really soon. Like, really soon. It would be very cool to see this. Yeah. Okay, so in the last couple of weeks, there has been news about Virgin Orbit. Yes, Virgin Orbit, their bankruptcy sale, they announced who has basically benefited from it. We have Rocket Lab is basically picking up the lease on Virgin Orbit's factory, which is really convenient for Rocket Lab because it's literally across the street in Long Beach. So they're going to acquire that space, the lease on it, and the hardware, the manufacturing equipment in there. Stratolaunch, who of course are working with The Rock and doing hypersonic launches with their Talon vehicle, they have acquired Cosmic Girl, and I presume that will add new launch capabilities, which may actually be cheaper in the long term than The Rock. The Rock is one of a kind, and if they need a replacement, it's a lot easier to get a 747 than it is to get something the size of Rock. And honestly, Talon seems a little small for this application. Finally, Vast, who you remember from the previous news episode, they had talked about launching this small space station for rich people. They previously acquired Launcher, who had been developing a launch vehicle of their own, and they've decided not to do that, but they are still developing their E2 rocket engine. And they have acquired Virgin Orbit's lease on the test site in Mojave so that they can continue to develop this engine. Now, notably, one thing which has not been sold at this point is the inventory at their Long Beach facility, i.e. the rockets they have built. Also, the intellectual property, the design of the rockets. I don't know if anyone will be interested in buying these, but definitely I can imagine that actually having working rocket engines would be a nice thing to have. But at this stage, there is nobody that is buying it. There is a fourth bidder who's buying a bunch of hardware from one of their facilities so that they can sell it on at this point. But they are not interesting because they are just, moving in and selling stuff. Okay, moving on to Blue Origin, who won the NASA contract for the second human landing system for the Artemis program. This will land humans on the moon for Artemis 5. And yeah, this is Blue Origin leading the national team, which consists of obviously them, but there's also Lockheed, Boeing, Draper, and a bunch of other smaller members. So these will be a second source lander for the Artemis program. And I have a lot more detail on this spacecraft in the video I made. But it's important to realize that this is a radical change from their previous design that they submitted, which was this multi-stage vehicle that had all sorts of complicated dockings and undockings and refuelings. This is a single stage reusable lander using hydrogen and oxygen as a propellant. Interestingly, the crew compartment is at the bottom near the ground, and the fuel tanks and the propellant tanks sit on top of this. Definitely an interesting design, but it is in many ways logistically simpler. Okay, anyway, what else happened? So there's a company called the Spaceport Company, and on May 23rd, they announced that they had launched 4 sounding rockets from a platform in the Gulf of Mexico. These rockets apparently they used engines developed by Evolution Space, who, if you remember, they had just hit the Kármán line flying out of the Friends of Amateur Rocketry site in Mojave. So the interesting thing about Spaceport Company is they want to provide offshore launching facilities for small rockets. And their design of their pad is something that goes just a little bit offshore and then puts these posts down onto the seabed so that it can stabilize itself and then perform the launch. So yeah, this is another interesting one to launch, given that, well, their idea is that there's a lot of contention for like a waterfront property to launch rockets from, and obviously SpaceX is seeing that right now. But we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. On May 25th, there was a meeting of the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, and one member, I think the chair of the committee, basically was expressing concern over NASA and Boeing rushing towards a launch of Starliner on July 21st. And the day after, NASA and Boeing issued a press release, basically saying that they are still working towards this July 21st date with a crew on board, which would be who would it be? It would be Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams. So they have a number of emerging issues that they still have to deal with. They have like a valve in the thermal control system which is not opening and closing, or it's providing reduced flow to one of the cooling loops. And they're having issues with, or they're reassessing their margins on the parachutes, including the efficiency of the joints in the system. There are waivers being issued for the batteries, but they're still aiming for a July 21st launch date. It's entirely possible that this ends up slipping. Of course, this is going to be launched by an Atlas V by ULA. ULA, for their part, they were trying to test Vulcan, which of course I have a nice model of right here, thanks to Tori Bruno. They set up the Vulcan to do a full-up dress rehearsal and engine test fire on the ground, and they didn't get all the way through this before they realized that there were timing issues with the igniters. So they've had to call off that test. They have since rolled Vulcan Centaur back to the vertical integration facility so they can get the panels off and work on this particular hardware to tune it for the requirements that they need for launch. So for Starship, they did release this absolutely amazing video, and they released it on Twitter, but there's a 4K version on YouTube, and it does show a few angles we hadn't previously seen. I do love the view from the control room with the windows vibrating, but for somebody that has watched and rewatched the video of this flight to try and learn things, the stuff that I really stood out to me was the drone shots which showed debris getting kicked out and getting a better handle on how quickly that debris was flying before it was hitting the surface. But also, there were a couple of shots from onboard cameras, one soon after launch, which looked down the side of the rocket, and one later as the vehicle was starting to spin out of control. And there are no missing tiles in that first shot. And then by the time it's spinning around, that's when the tiles are missing. And this is a big step, because previously, during tests, we would see the engines fire and the tiles would just fall off. That clearly hasn't happened in this case. These tiles stayed on until they were well through max Q. So that to me says that they have actually made advancements in the capabilities of the heat shield. Now, of course, whether Starship flies again, there are some issues, because there has of course been this court case filed by several environmental groups and Native American groups against the Federal Aviation Administration, saying that the FAA improperly carried out the environmental review and they should suspend SpaceX launches until they have done a proper review. Now, in the last week or so, SpaceX has filed documents basically saying that actually we would like to get added to this case because it really directly affects us. What's perhaps most interesting to the Starship watchers out there is the fact that these documents reveal that SpaceX has spent about $5 billion so far developing Starship and the facilities at Boca Chica. So that really puts some idea about how much money was being put into this. This is, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we also had the Office of Inspector General come out with another review on SLS and pretty much say what we all knew, that SLS is costing way more than it should. And those engines, for example, the Aerojet Rocketdyne are supposed to be developing that are going to be cheaper, and they're supposed to be they're spending way too much money on these engines, which have already effectively been developed. Yeah, that's not the greatest look But yeah, at the same time, SpaceX still spending a lot of money on Starship. They expected to spend about $2 billion this year, so we can extrapolate that forward and say that, you know, a few years down the road, they'll have spent at least $10 billion on this program, which is still small compared to what has been spent on SLS. Finally, in the last couple of weeks, we got confirmation on what happened to Hakuto R, that is iSpace's lander that landed on the moon, and it was a software error. I have a more detailed video on what exactly happened, but the summary is that the software began ignoring the altimeter, the radar altimeter, because it was returning values that changed too quickly because the terrain was changing too quickly. So yeah, out of spec results confused the system and they started ignoring it, and then they ended up landing at the wrong altitude, falling to the lunar surface and breaking, unfortunately. So yeah, that is my quick roundup of the news for these last couple of weeks. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.